Every empire in history claimed to be powerful. Every king called himself undefeatable. Every army believed it was unstoppable. But only one empire in all of ancient history made the entire world genuinely afraid. Not one region, not one enemy. Every civilization, every kingdom, every people, from China to Rome, trembled at their name. They didn't just conquer land, they erased civilizations. They didn't just defeat armies, they ended empires. Who were they? Stay until the end, because the answer will shock you. Before we reveal the most dangerous empire in ancient history, we need to understand what dangerous actually means. Because dangerous is not the same as largest. The British Empire controlled more territory than any empire in history, covering 25% of the entire Earth's surface. But it built much of that through trade, administration, and gradual control, not pure military terror. Dangerous is not the same as longest lasting. The Egyptian civilization lasted 3,000 years, remarkable staying power. But Egypt was rarely an aggressive military threat to the wider world. Dangerous means something very specific: the capacity to project overwhelming military force, the willingness to use total destruction as a weapon, and the ability to fundamentally alter the course of history through sheer violent power. By that definition, history gives us several candidates: Assyria, the Mongols, Rome, the Huns, Alexander's Macedonia. All terrifying, all historically significant. But when you examine the full record, one empire stands above all others in sheer, concentrated, world-altering danger. And that empire is Assyria. The Assyrian Empire. Most people have never heard of them, and that is one of the great injustices of history. Because the Assyrians were arguably the most terrifying military force the ancient world ever produced, they dominated the Middle East for over 300 years, from approximately 900 BC to 612 BC. At their peak, the Assyrian Empire stretched from Egypt in the west to Iran in the east, from the mountains of Turkey in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. They controlled the entire Fertile Crescent, the cradle of human civilization, and they held it through a system of military power and deliberate terror, so effective that historians still study it today. Their capital, Nineveh, was the largest city in the world at its peak, with a population of over 150,000 people, a city of magnificent palaces, elaborate gardens, vast libraries. King Ashurbanipal, one of Assyria's greatest rulers, built a library of over 30,000 clay tablets, preserving ancient knowledge, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written stories in human history. The Assyrians were not just warriors. They were administrators, engineers, and scholars. But it is their military that history remembers most. The Assyrian military was the most advanced fighting force the ancient world had produced, by a significant margin. Iron weapons, when most armies were still using bronze. Iron is harder, sharper, more durable. An Assyrian soldier with an iron sword was facing enemies with weapons he could literally cut through. Cavalry. The Assyrians were among the first armies to use cavalry effectively, mounted warriors who could move faster than any infantry force, striking before enemies could organize, pursuing fleeing armies until they were completely destroyed. Siege warfare. Here is where the Assyrians truly revolutionized warfare. Before the Assyrians, cities could often survive sieges simply by closing their gates and waiting behind strong walls. The Assyrians changed that. They developed battering rams, massive wheeled machines that could smash through city gates. Siege ramps, Enormous earthen ramps built up against city walls so soldiers could storm them directly. Undermining, tunneling beneath walls to collapse them. Mobile siege towers, wheeled towers that could be pushed up to walls, allowing archers to fire down into the city. No city was truly safe anymore. And the Assyrians made sure everyone knew it. But the Assyrians' most powerful weapon was not iron. It was not cavalry. It was not siege engines. It was fear. The Assyrians were the first empire in history to use systematic terror as a deliberate military and political strategy. And they documented it themselves, proudly, carved into the walls of their palace in explicit detail. Assyrian royal inscriptions describe their campaigns in language that still shocks modern readers. King Ashur-Nasir-Pal II, one of the most feared Assyrian rulers, wrote about his campaigns with almost casual brutality. He described building pyramids of human heads outside conquered cities, flaying enemies alive and draping their skins over city walls, impaling survivors on stakes around conquered towns, burning children, cutting off hands, feet, noses, and ears of prisoners, and piling them in heaps as visible warnings. Why are we talking about this? Not for shock value, but because this was calculated strategy. The Assyrians discovered something cold and logical. If the reputation of what happens to those who resist is terrifying enough, most people will not resist. And they were right. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, surrendered without a fight, simply at the news that the Assyrian army was coming. The terror saved lives in a horrifying, twisted way, because the cities that surrendered were often treated with relative mercy. Only the ones that resisted were destroyed completely. The list of what the Assyrians conquered reads like a catalog of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. Babylon, the most famous city in the ancient world, conquered multiple times. And when it rebelled once too often, King Sennacherib destroyed it so completely that he reportedly diverted a river to flood the ruins. Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, was conquered by King Shalmaneser V in 722 BC. The population, the famous 10 lost tribes of Israel, was deported across the empire and effectively disappeared from history. This is where the biblical account of Assyria enters recorded history. The Assyrians appear repeatedly in the Old Testament as the Great Terror from the north. Egypt. In 671 BC, King Esarhaddon achieved something that had seemed impossible. He conquered Egypt, the land of the pyramids, the civilization that had lasted 2,000 years. The most powerful kingdom in Africa fell to Assyria. For a brief, extraordinary period, the Assyrian Empire controlled everything from Egypt to Iran, the entire known world of the ancient Middle East, under one king, one empire, Assyria. The Assyrian Empire produced a remarkable series of military kings, each one expanding the empire further than the last. Tiglath-Pileser III, possibly the greatest military reformer in Assyrian history. He transformed the Assyrian army from a seasonal force of conscripts into the world's first professional standing army. Soldiers who trained year-round, fought year-round, were paid year-round. This gave Assyria a military advantage over every neighbor, because while other kingdoms mobilized armies for specific campaigns, Assyria was always ready. Sargon II, who named himself after the legendary Sargon of Akkad, one of history's first empire builders, extended Assyrian control to its greatest geographic extent. He deported conquered populations on a massive scale, moving peoples from their homelands to different parts of the empire, deliberately destroying cultural identity to prevent rebellion. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, was a fascinating contradiction. A man who wrote poetry, who collected the greatest library of the ancient world, who also personally described in his inscriptions hunting lions from his chariot, and recorded his military campaigns with the same casual brutality as his predecessors. He was simultaneously the most literate and the most violent ruler of the ancient world. And then, in one of history's most dramatic reversals, the most feared empire in the ancient world collapsed almost overnight. 612 BC. A coalition of enemies, the Babylonians and the Medes, peoples who had suffered under Assyrian rule for generations, combined their forces and attacked. They besieged Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, the city that had seemed eternal, the center of the most powerful empire on earth. It fell in 3 months. The city was burned to the ground, so completely destroyed that within a generation, people were not entirely sure where it had stood. The Greek historian Xenophon, writing just 200 years later, marched his army past the ruins of Nineveh and did not even know what city the ruins had been. The greatest empire of the ancient world was so thoroughly erased that within 2 centuries, it was forgotten. How does the most powerful empire on earth simply vanish? Because the Assyrians had built their empire entirely on military terror. When the military failed, there was no cultural loyalty, no shared identity, no reason for subject peoples to defend them. Every people they had ever conquered celebrated their destruction. So why does Assyria win the title of most dangerous empire in ancient history? Not because of size, though they were enormous. Not because of duration, though they lasted 300 years. But because of impact. The Assyrians invented modern warfare. Every military innovation they pioneered, professional armies, combined arms tactics, siege warfare, psychological terror, was adopted, refined, and used by every empire that came after them. Alexander the Great used siege techniques the Assyrians had perfected 400 years earlier. Rome built its military dominance on principles the Assyrians had established. Every modern army on earth is the distant descendant of the military revolution the Assyrians created. They also permanently reshaped the Middle East. The deportation of the 10 tribes of Israel, still debated and mourned 2,700 years later. The destruction of ancient Babylon, an event so traumatic it echoes through the Bible, the Quran, and world literature to this day. The collapse of Bronze Age civilization patterns across the entire Fertile Crescent, replaced by new peoples, new kingdoms, new power structures, all created by Assyrian conquest. The world we live in today, the political map of the Middle East, the religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were all shaped, directly and indirectly, by the Assyrian Empire. An empire most people have never heard of. An empire that changed everything. The Assyrians built the most dangerous empire the ancient world had ever seen. They invented the tools of war that every army after them would use. They reshaped the map of the Middle East so completely that the effects are still visible today. They were feared from Egypt to Iran, from the mountains of Turkey to the shores of the Persian Gulf. And then, they were gone. So completely gone that the world forgot they had existed. Until archaeologists in the 19th century began digging in the deserts of modern Iraq and found the palaces of Nineveh, the carvings of their conquests, the library of Ashurbanipal, a civilization buried under sand, waiting to remind us that the most powerful empires in history are sometimes the ones we never learned about. If this video gave you something new, like it. It helps this channel more than you know. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's forgotten empires and lost civilizations. And tell me in the comments, did you know about the Assyrian Empire before this video? I will see you in the next one.